Anki Mukherjee here. I'm fellow and tutor in English at Wadham College and professor of English and World Literatures here at Oxford. We are here today to highlight and celebrate Wadham's special collections, in particular the first editions of most of Charles Dickens's novels published in book form. The books came from Harry King, barrister, librarian of the Garrick Club in London, and Wadham Fellow from 1844 to 1888. We don't know when he gave the books to us, but they were probably bequeathed in 1889. With me is Robert Douglas Fairhurst, Professor of English Literature at Oxford and Fellow of Magdalen College, a world-leading expert on Charles Dickens. Robert has published widely in the field of 19th century literature, and I would like to single out for praise his second book, Becoming Dickens, The Invention of a Novelist, which won the 2012 Duff Cooper Prize for Biography, and his fourth, The Turning Point, A Year in the Life of Charles Dickens, published in 2021. The books are not only critically acclaimed and widely talked about, but they are also read, enjoyed, and taught. Becoming Dickens is about a perilous self-fashioning, Dickens's invention of himself as novelist. That is also a reinvention of the novel, as Francis Wilson pointed out in his glowing review. If this literary biography focused on the 1830s, The Turning Point zeroes in on 1851, the year of the Great Exhibition, and one in which, Douglas Fairhurst argues, Dickens's own writing deepened and saddened and became more world-facing and attuned to the social. Douglas Fairhurst's Dickens criticism is a veritable spiderweb of connections. It's a metaphor Dickens liked. Spiderweb of connections between and within the novels, between the novels and the life worlds they inhabit or bring to being, and finally between Dickens and his readers. The writing is versatile, strong, and beautiful, like spider silk. Robert's other monographs include The Story of Alice, Lewis Carroll and the Secret History of Wonderland, and Metamorphosis, a memoir of rude life under the regime of multiple sclerosis. I can't wait to hear what he has to say of these books. Take it away.
Thank you. What a lovely introduction. Thank you so much. Actually, there's one thing I can add to your very generous introduction, which is that, and it's a bit of gossip, which is that until I was about 10 years old, I lived in a street in South London called Dickens Drive. So it was fate. Pickwick Close was just around the corner, as was Copperfield Way. The reason I mention that is that it shows, I think, that Dickens is everywhere. Yeah, you think about the catchphrases like bar humbug, or please sir I want some more. You think about the costume dramas. You think about the fact that it was his face that used to be on the back of the £10 note. The last time I walked down Rochester High Street, I came across an Indian restaurant called A Taste of Two Cities. And there was also, rather more oddly, there was what was it? It was Little Dorrit body piercing as well. So Dickens really is everywhere. In fact, he even makes a kind of walk-on appearance in Zadie Smith's novel that's just been published. So that's why I'm so pleased to be here, because I thought that what we could do today is maybe look at the story behind the stories and think about how it is that Dickens did become this extraordinary kind of literary and cultural giant. And looking at the books, I mean, you can see just the sheer range and depth of the material that your former fellow gathered. You see just how much he wrote. And how detailed and how various what he wrote is. So I think what we might do then is maybe sort of go through some of the highlights and just think about what they tell us about Dickens and about his world. Does that sound good?
Yes.
Okay, so if we begin with the beginning, before Dickens there was Boz. So what I have here first of all is a collection of the sketches and stories that he started to put together when he was a very young man in his 20s in the 1830s, when he adopted the pen name of Boz. and published these pieces in a range of different journals and magazines. What we have in the illustration, the title page illustration here, is you can see him and his prickly, difficult collaborator and illustrator, George Cruikshank, waving flags as their hot air balloon kind of gradually rises. This is clearly supposed to be a metaphor because in Dickens's preface he talks about this book being a pilot balloon which he's sending out into the world and hopes that it's going to be followed up by more publications. But what's more interesting than that perhaps is the range of people you can see underneath the title sketches by Boz who are kind of cheering and kind of waving their hats and their walking sticks in the air. Because this is not only Dickens's audience, this is also a set of Dickens's subjects. These are the people that these sketches and stories are written about. He holds up a distorting lens or a kind of strange funfair mirror to ordinary people, especially ordinary Londoners, and he shows them their lives as if their lives had been refracted through this strange imagination. And in fact, if we look at some of the illustrations, let's find a good one. Yeah, this is a good illustration. So this is showing some sort of hustings for an election for a local beadle. What you see is a range of different people. These are the people he's writing about and writing for. It also, though, starts to affect the way he starts to write. This is democratic writing for an increasingly democratic age because it includes everything and everyone. And the style kind of jitters around unpredictably between comedy and pathos, belly laughs and tears. What he called a streaky bacon kind of writing, just streaked with humour and with tears. And that is then what he then started to develop and ended up extending into his first proper novel. Should we look at that?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. This is the posthumous papers of the Pickwick Club. This is something that started off as just another set of sketches. But as it developed, it picked up a kind of traction with the reading public. And what had originally been only read by a few hundred people, by the end of its run was read by tens of thousands of people, published in monthly instalments. The story behind this story, though, is here. You can see on the title page, 43 illustrations by R. Seymour and Fizz. Okay, Fizz was the pen name of Hablot Brown, who became his most regular collaborator as an illustrator and produced these kind of extraordinarily kind of comic and sentimental and grotesque illustrations. R. Seymour, though, Robert Seymour, was the person who originally was the leader of this project when it started. It was going to be a series of plates designed by him, illustrations, which would then have some accompanying text. And Dickens was drafted in as a jobbing writer about town to add that text. Gradually, though, in the first few months, Dickens started to take the project over. The words started to kind of overmaster the illustrations. He started to boss Seymour around. Seymour was already suffering depression, and he ended up taking his fowling piece, his rifle, into his garden in Islington and shooting himself. So after his suicide, Dickens decided he needed a new collaborator. He got Brown involved, and what they produced was a cultural miracle, really. It became an extraordinary success with pretty much every kind of reader you could imagine. And it produced offshoots and imitations and plagiaries and parodies. We had Pickwick in India, we had Pickwick in America. We have Fat Boy sweets. We have Fat Boy pastries. We have Pickwick trousers. We have a whole kind of panoply of sort of cultural ephemera that is kind of brought along with this. And it's why a lot of people say that Dickens became an overnight success because of this novel. If you want an analogy, it's like a kind of superhero who goes into the telephone box as an ordinary human being. He exits as, you know, the most famous writer in the world, but still known popularly as Boz, not as Charles Dickens. It's interesting that when he publishes it as a book, though, we have by Charles Dickens, because this is now Dickens making his pitch for posterity. This is now Dickens trying to assert his credentials as a proper writer rather than just a sort of jobbing journalist and sketch writer. Club. Oh, actually, one other thing I'll show you is to this illustration here. This is the Pickwick Club, which is a group of eccentrics and adventurers with Mr. Pickwick as one of their members. You can see that it's a group of people gathered around a table. It's sociable. It's a debating club. It's a kind of surrogate family. Over time, Dickens's readers felt that they were also becoming part of this surrogate family. And there were real-life Pickwick clubs set up all around the world. Many of them lasted into the 20th century. And it's allowed people who then wrote to Dickens offering advice and suggestions and complaints about how he was developing his characters to feel as if they were part of this ongoing kind of expanding cultural family. They weren't just looking at it from the outside, they were part of it as it was developing. So now we move on to Nicholas Nickleby, which was turned into an extraordinary multi-hour extravaganza by the Royal Shakespeare Company in the 1980s. And you can see why, because if you look at the title page illustration here, so this kind of frontispiece, this is an engraving based on the portrait by Dickens's friend Daniel Nickleby, which is now in the National Portrait Gallery. Dickens actually said that his look, just looking over his shoulder, was the look of a man who's heard that the house of his greatest enemy is on fire. Sort of curious, not displeased. But also, if you look at the theatricality of his clothes and the hair, and then you turn over the page and you realise that it is dedicated to William Macready, the great early Victorian actor, you start to realise that Dickens's fiction, certainly the early fiction, is emerging out of his obsession with the theatre. At one stage he auditioned to become an actor. He enjoyed playing in amateur theatricals. He enjoyed gathering groups of friends together and directing them in theatricals. He wrote a couple of early plays. Nicholas Nickleby involves the hero going on tour with a bunch of kind of strolling players. So you start to see here then that although Dickens rejected that life or never fully took it up as a profession, it started to inform the way that he wrote. And not only the way that he wrote, but also the look of the books themselves. If we look at the illustrations here, which are still being done by Hablot Brown, known as Fizz, this one, for instance, which shows Nicholas beating Wackford Squeers, the evil, sadistic headmaster of Dotheboys Hall, with the other boys kind of either cowering and cringing or kind of cheering. You notice it is like a scene from a melodrama. It's an example of what was called at the time the point being the moment in a melodrama where the characters freeze at a particularly kind of impressive moment of passion or kind of rage, or where the plot sort of explodes for the audience to applaud, and then the action carries on. It's as if with these illustrations, Fizz had tried to take that idea of the melodramatic point and fix it permanently on the page. Even though the story, of course, carries on, we as readers have the opportunity to enjoy that moment of melodramatic climax and always return to it. It's never going to, it's never going to change. So yes, this is Dickens, the novelist, but also increasingly the amateur theatrical genius. So let's move on to Martin Chuzzlewit by, as the illustration shows you here, Charles Dickens. He's very clearly now moved away from the world of Boz. He's now very clearly setting himself up as a novelist. And in fact, you see that also in this illustration here. You notice it's much more complicated, much more fiddly. It involves far more characters and scenes from the novel that he'd planned out in advance. And that is a way of showing that Dickens indeed was starting to think of himself as a novelist writing whole books and not just these episodic, serialised, kind of picaresque capers where one thing would bounce onto another without necessarily leading anywhere in particular. So Martin Chuzzlewit, what's interesting about this is that Dickens was starting to go through something like a kind of mid-career crisis. So the reviews weren't as enthusiastic, the readers were falling away. He needed to do something to give his career a jolt. And what he chose to do was to go to America on a lecture tour and a public reading tour. And what that produces in Martin Chuzzlewit is a kind of mimicking where the hero also goes to America. And yes, actually, so here the fact that it's dedicated to Angela Burdett Coutts, or Miss Burdett Coutts, as he puts it here, this is also evidence of how Dickens was, he was branching out, he was expanding his kind of range, not just his range of readers with America, but his range of social influence. Because Angela Burdett Coutts, like the Coutts Bank, was an heiress, one of the richest women in the world, who funded various philanthropic enterprises. And she and Dickens struck up this rather kind of curious friendship that was mostly just conducted by letters. But eventually she would put up a big chunk of money for him to buy and furnish and run a home for fallen women, in other words, prostitutes and former prostitutes, known as Urania Cottage in Shepherd's Bush. That wasn't for many years, but already you can see him sucking up is perhaps too crude, but certainly solidifying his relationship with people who might prove to be influential and helpful to him.